Hey everyone, my name's Mike, and this is a painting I did really recently. And I thought it'd be really fun to do a time-lapse video with some audio commentary over top of it, kind of just describing the way I went about creating this picture here. So the first thing I do is I create this perspective grid. It's a simple one-point perspective grid, and I already had a very strong idea in my head of what I wanted this painting to be ahead of time. So this grid helps me define the camera angle, the viewer position in the scene, what they're looking at, their line of sight, the cone of vision. And as I'm drawing, it helps things look more three-dimensional, as true to form as possible, and just keeping them actually in perspective. So right now I'm trying to define some of the stonework on this wall, and I want it to be very geometric looking. All the man-made objects I'm trying to keep as geometric looking as possible. So these hard, edgy lines you see in the stonework, leading your eye from left to right. The subject matter is going to be on the right side of this picture plane. So they're leading your eye. This foliage, again, growing from left to right, leading your eye across the picture plane to the main subject matter. Creates a nice flow. And the foliage itself, the nice curvy lines, contrast nicely with the man-made objects and the edgy forms I'm using here. Again, drawing some more vines. Now that vine is going to be behind the subject matter, so I'm playing a bit, seeing a different shape I might need. So you see I flipped the canvas there, and what that does is it helps you see things at a totally new viewpoint. It helps you pick up errors and mistakes. It helps you see if proportions are correct, and it just gives you a totally different view on the scene to help you create a better picture. And I'll consistently try to flip the canvas as I'm painting as well, just to see if things are looking okay and if I need to change something. I've learned that trick from a lot of different artists, and it's so useful. So here I'm doing some more stonework. I'm trying to give the illusion of stonework inspired somewhat by foliage as well. I think that ties in nicely with the natural foliage, and human beings kind of throughout history have used the natural environment in their designs as well, so it makes it look a little bit more realistic. And I think it just kind of looks cool. But I'm trying to keep the foliage in the geometric stonework looking as rigid as possible, and the curves very simple, again, to give the idea of simplicity and clean geometric lines and look. So again, more stonework, that strong curve, and the idea of leaves or some type of palm fronds growing out from this stonework here, keeping it very clean and simple looking. And you can see I flipped this, and these two curves, they kind of oppose there. They're kind of running in different directions, kind of tangent. And I got that idea from one of my favorite artists, Syd Mead. And he mentioned that in one of his, I believe it was a Gnomon DVD tutorial. I can post a link to that later also. But it's just a really cool design technique that he used in one of his tutorial videos. And I wanted to give it a shot and try it out because I thought it was really cool looking and in that stonework there. So here I'm filling in some of the gaps in the stonework, trying to find a nice design here. What do I want to do? And I settled on this design here. It kind of looks like blades of grass. I thought it was kind of a cool design. Very simple, clean looking. I'm trying to find a curve here. I can't quite get it, so I'm just randomly squiggling around here. Like, I have no idea what I want to do, but I think I'll know when I see it. And okay, I found that curve, I like it, and I did a little design similar to the one in the middle of the picture plane there. Filling in some more geometric lines where it's kind of empty. I struggle a bit with this line here because I want it, again, not to be distracting, and I want it to lead your eye to the subject matter, so point downwards. You can see I changed it from pointing upwards to downwards there. Here drawing some large palm fronds or some type of large leaf, just to break up some of the finer foliage there, and I thought it kind of added a nice silhouette to the scene, made it look a little bit more tropical too, and they kind of lead your eye down away from that top there. It was looking way too empty. Trying to define the interior of this doorway, just to have something there so it doesn't look so empty. The other thing I should mention is this is a very wide shot, so it's a very wide picture plane, not too tall, and again that's very deliberate to make things look more geometric and to lead your eye horizontally across the picture plane, which is what I wanted. So here I'm designing one of the main focal points, the main subject matter, which is a guard kind of chilling outside of this. It's meant to be a fancy kind of LA restaurant or something. So I'm trying to find a good position for him. He's kind of has to look as natural as possible. So I'm trying to find the major forms, simple shapes, cylinders, boxes, in perspective. Just trying to find that shape of his body without thinking about details too much to make him look like he's kind of resting with his leg against the wall there. And he's going to be holding a leash, which you'll see later. Now here, he's going to be holding a leash to a kind of a dog, like kind of mutated creature. And I wanted this to be kind of in a different perspective than everything else in the scene, kind of a 2-point perspective, so he's kind of angled slightly as he's kind of resting on the sidewalk looking to the left. So I'm designing another perspective grid, keeping in mind where my center of vision is on this picture plane, which is where that red line is. Now perspective is a very complicated thing to learn, and it's kind of very dry topic, very boring. So what I'll do is I'll post some resources for perspective in the description, because it's something quite complicated. You need to dedicate a lot of time to explain. So I'm just mentioning some basics here of what I did. Now here I want this dog creature to be inspired kind of by a Doberman pincer. I think that's how you pronounce it. I don't know. But anyways, so I got a reference from the internet, just using the basic forms to keep it more or less looking like that breed of dog. But it's not going to, I don't want it to look exactly like that, because that'd be kind of boring, right? So I want it to be kind of a play on that breed, and you can see it has like a larger tail, and its head is very sleek and kind of wide and kind of a thicker neck, and I want it to look almost like a cross between a dog and some type of reptile, like maybe like a Komodo dragon or something, just to give it a bit of edge and, you know, make it look a little cool, different. Here I struggle a bit with the goggles of this character here. They look horrible right now. He looks like I don't know, some type of Mortal Kombat character or something. I don't like it at all, so I just erased that and define some basic facial shapes, just because I need something there to find where the lips are going to be, where the nose, like, it doesn't look good to me right now, but again, it's just a guide, which I'll paint over later. So I'm trying to find that goggle shape I want. I'm trying to give this guy a bit of a retro futuristic feel, almost like the way they interpreted the future in the 50s, for example, like with kind of sometimes more clunky outfits and vibrant colors. And I thought it'd be, I don't know, I just like that look as opposed to some of the more modern take on the future, which can be, I don't know, too spacey or overly complicated, which is cool too, but it's, I don't know, I like the simpler approach sometimes. It's just, it's a nice break from some of the modern stuff that we tend to be accustomed to. Here I changed that to a circular pattern, you can see, and that's going to be like a menu. You can see I squiggled some lines on there. And I want there to be large beams of light going into the scene, and they have to follow perspective too, so I'm putting the perspective grid on there again. It streams across this wall, and it helps define that there's something outside of this picture that you're seeing. It gives the illusion that this space is bigger than it actually appears, because there's something blocking these streams of light along this wall, so it makes it look bigger, more realistic, and it adds some nice dimension and breaks up the shape of that wall a bit because it's a little too plain right now. So you can see I've started painting, trying to find a basic color tone I want. I'm not too worried about balancing the value right now, but I'm just plopping in some color, going for it. I know I want the wall to be a purpley, very muted hue to it, so I just start with something just to lay down some color. Painting in the bushes there, which I don't think I mentioned before. Those bushes out in front, I wanted them to be quite geometric in shape, something like finely trimmed by some landscapers outside of this fancy restaurant to make it look a bit more kind of proper, and they like to take care of what their place looks like, so it looks like a place maybe a bit more expensive to go and more streamlined. So defining the sidewalk a bit, just a bit of a higher value color there where the light's going to hit a little more as opposed to the wall where it's going to hit more at an angle and it's not going to receive as much light. So you can see the stonework there. I've added a darker color because the stonework is kind of embossed and chiseled in there, so it's going to be darker where the light can't get to, where it can't escape from, like due to ambient occlusion, for example, and the angle at which it's shining against the wall, it's simply not going to reach those areas. So you can also see I just added some highlights there where the light is going to hit the edge of those cut lines, because the light's coming in at a downward angle kind of from the top left, and you kind of got to keep in mind that light source at all times. Now I'll talk more about lighting as I go along, especially concerning the streaks of sunlight that are going to come in, because that definitely changes specific regions that are lit. But in general, there's always a diffuse level of light coming into a scene, and if you know the general light direction, you can kind of start shading things to a certain degree and then tweak them later. So again, like I'm just thinking top left, where's the light going to hit on these edges? Where's it not going to hit? Where's the light not going to escape from, not going to get to? Just tweaking the levels on this. I do that a lot. It helps a lot. Help it match the rest of the stonework. Right now it's a little too dark, so I got to balance it out because it stands out too much. I use the pen tool a lot for this because these are quite smooth curves, and if they're too jagged or you have a shaky hand sometimes, it's just not going to look good. So the pen tool gives a better accurate curve sometimes, and then you just stroke the curve. Here I'm trying to define the wall is too flat. It needs some texture to it, some grip like you'd see on a real canvas, and just some dirt basically, and little flecks of materials that were perhaps in the stonework when they first put it up, and just natural materials, whatever. Like it just needs something, some texture. So I just did some random brush strokes with a dual brush with some scatter capabilities, and put it on a new layer, lowered the opacity, and I also did one with some brighter sections too, just to give it a bit of texture. Here I've defined the sun streaked areas, put it on a new layer with, I believe it was overlay or screen for the time being, just to lighten it up, just to define where those shapes are going to be and whether they're going to work or not for me. And there I've just kind of implemented the areas where those holes are going to be, where the vines are going to grow out of. I downloaded some free brushes here just to, I knew there was going to be a lot of foliage in this picture, and I didn't want to do it all by hand with a small brush. It would just take too long. So I used some of these foliage brushes just to fill in the main areas and angle it at different angles along the vines here, just to fill it out, add some interesting leaf shapes, use some darker colors, some lighter colors, give it more shape, dimension, form, just to make it look full, but you know, have some flow to it, staying along those curvy vines. And then I go in after and I paint individual leaves and large chunks of area, just defining form and shape, just to break up that kind of rigid brush texture that I implemented. Just makes it look a little more painterly. And right now these are sticking out way too much. They're way too distracting. So I need to balance it out, and what I do is I balance out the levels and the hue a bit, make it a little more bluey, which is kind of the look I wanted. I don't know, I like that look sometimes of almost a bluey hue to leaves. It just looks really cool. And make them a little higher value, a little brighter, so they don't stick out as much. They're not as contrasty, but they still lead your eye. But they don't dominate the scene. So copying, pasting these using the warp tool to kind of define different shapes. I erase different parts of it out so it doesn't look duplicated, because that would just look really bad, not natural. So you got to kind of modify it a bit. This saves a lot of time. You could do it again by hand, but again, I mean, why would you if you have the tools? That's what's great about Photoshop, right? It's kind of a nice compromise between the way you traditionally work and digital. My cat is right on my keyboard. It's really distracting. Okay. I'm petting her now to calm her down a bit. She wants attention now. She's biting me. Okay, anyways. So I'm working on this door frame here. And I wanted kind of a lighter color, like white as it would appear in darkness. So not to stand out too much, but just to define that doorway and the area around where this holographic type menu is going to be. The other thing about those sun streaks is, again, it adds to the geometric feel of the scene. Again, perhaps there's big beams overhead. Maybe this area is in like a glassed-in area with beams. And I like the harshness of those lines and the angle. They lead your eye again from top to bottom, left to right. Defining a floor pattern here. Almost a tile work of some sort. I just needed something. I like the black and white with the red too. I like that. The black and red combination of color, it's a very, I guess, rich looking color set, and I think it works well for like a fancy restaurant or someplace like that. So I'm defining a couple areas of strong light sources inside. Maybe there's a light on the left, some type of red light on the right, streaming across the doorway area here, hitting the wall. Again, give it some more life, some more dimension, and it just kind of looks cool. Add some contrast to the tile work too. And that red streak along the center there, that area is like a windowed area, very streamlined, slim windowed area, and it kind of looks futuristic-y, and I just like the pattern. Stretches across the entire canvas. It looks kind of cool, and it's all glassed in, so a new layer with kind of a glass color. And right now working on this foliage here, this bush foliage. I did this by hand because I don't really have a brush suitable to do this, so I worked on a specific section trying to add areas of light and dark where the sun's going to hit, where the sun's not going to hit, areas that are going to be shadowed, make it look like smaller areas of leaves, trimmed leaves, and copy and paste that over. The pattern's random enough that you're not going to notice that it's copied anyways, and then clean up the lines, the edges later on. Working on the top here, it's in perspective, so it's going to be a bit more foreshortened and squashed, so I'm trying to keep that in mind. And again, turning on the perspective grid, putting this area in perspective because it's relevant to the one-point perspective. It makes it look more three-dimensional, it gives a better flow. It won't look as flat if I do this. So again, always keeping in mind that perspective grid as much as I need to. Sometimes you can BS perspective, which is fine. Sometimes it actually makes it look cooler. You don't want to think too much about perspective all the time because you just get distracted and you tend to stiffen up a bit. So, like, don't worry about it too much, but always keep it in mind. And I think that just comes the more you paint. And you can always fix things, right? So defining some dirt where the bushes are coming out of, giving it a bit of form and shape. Areas where the dirt's going to be built up and little ridges and valleys. Technical wise, I should talk about this painting too, since I haven't really talked about that. I'm doing this in Photoshop CS4. I have a Wacom or Wacom? I'm not sure how to pronounce it. I think it's Wacom tablet, but it's a Wacom tablet. Intuos 3 12 by 9 inch tablet, which is awesome. I love it. It's one of the best investments I ever made. I use it all the time now. And the image resolution is about 10,000 pixels wide right now, I think. I try to work as high resolution as I can, as your computer can handle. Oh, I should mention, since these bushes are essentially a large basic form with minor variations, you have to shade them as such, so the light's going to hit the top there, and areas on the right side of the bush are going to be in shadows, so you have to shade them accordingly with a big brush, using maybe like multiply or screen, which will darken or lighten the hues that are already there, or you could just paint it over with a large brush on normal and lower opacity just to lighten and darken those areas. Again, flecks of different materials or dirt on this sidewalk, adding some horizontal dark areas just to give it a bit of flow, left to right flow. Working on the leaves here now. I kind of cut out the sides of them just to give them a bit of a different shape rather than just be like triangular, so to speak. I wanted to cut out the sides of them just to give them a bit of a more edgy look to them. So I'm trying to find the shape here that I want, the texture that I want. So I did go online and look up some pictures of different vegetation just to get kind of the material that I wanted for this. So here defining some they're almost like veins. I don't know exactly what they're called, but to me they look like veins that you see all the time in leaves, and it just adds a bit of texture, more texture to these things, and also defines the form a bit as they curve around this leaf as it's hanging down. It helps define that shape a bit. A bit. It follows the form. Here defining some areas of dark and light on the major form, where the light's going to hit, where the light is not going to hit as much. On the other side of that right side of those leaves, where it's hanging down and curving over, the light's not going to get to there as much. Now they needed something on the edge here just to give where the sun's really going to hit, and it helped them pop a bit and gave them a bit more shape and form, and it just looked cool. So I added that into all the leaves. Even though perspective-wise you might not see the top side of that, maybe just a bit, but perhaps if it's kind of angled more, you would see more of that. So again, whatever aesthetically looks best, sometimes that's what you got to do, right? Playing with the value here and the hue, again trying to get that bluish look, maintain the dark value of these leaves against the lighter wall. It helps them pop. There's also a black and white layer. I should mention that. I frequently turn that off and on. You'll probably see the whole image go to black and white frequently, and what that does is it helps you just see the values, because color can be very distracting, and color and value are kind of, I don't know how to describe it, but they're two different elements almost. Like, essentially for each thing that you paint, there's a hue value, which is brightness essentially, and saturation. So by turning that black and white layer on, it helps you just see the values. So you put a layer, you just fill it with black and set it on saturation for the blending mode, and it will turn the whole thing into grayscale, so you can just see values. It's another useful thing I learned from Feng Zhu, actually, another concept artist I really like. So here, filling in that main subject matter form, that guard chilling outside of this building, I knew I wanted it to be kind of orange and white, kind of pop from the rest of the scene, warmer color, a bit more saturated. It helps him stick out more. And I just like that orange look. I wanted to do something with orange recently, and this kind of filled that gap, and I think it fits nicely with the rest of the scene. Defined a facial color there, which did not work at all, so I immediately changed that, actually. Look, a better skin tone there. Again, I just plopped some color on there, see if it worked. Nope, didn't work, so change it. Now it has more of a reddish hue to it, a darker value for this gentleman's skin tone here. Cleaning up the lines, not thinking too much about light or anything, basically just, I guess you call it underpainting in traditional painting, I believe. Just filling in some blobs of color, some midtones. Here I'm trying to find a bit of shape. So these legs, got to start somewhere, right? So where the light's going to hit, and trying to keep in mind some folds. I want his pants to have some subtle folds to them. I don't want them to be shiny. I want them to be kind of like a cloth-like material. Not stick out too much, but they have to fold. Where the leg's going to bend, folds are quite difficult to do. Sometimes you just got to get in there and try different shapes and see what works. But again, think about where the light's hitting. Think about, like, go in the mirror, right? Like, go in the mirror, look at your pants as they fold. Look at your shirt as it folds around your body, and see what it looks like. Like, that's the best reference, right, from real life. So you can also use, your knowledge of perspective and geometry and three-dimensional building, but sometimes you just get stuck, right, and you need better reference. So go online, get reference, and get reference from real life, look around the house. And that's what I did also for this person. Like, I went against a wall, and I kind of put my foot against the wall, and I thought, does this feel natural? How would my arms be? How far would I be away from the wall? Like, what's a natural pose? And that helped me kind of establish this pose a bit more too. So now it's kind of starting to come together a little more. And you never want your line drawing to hold. If you're not going to include your line drawing in the final painting, you don't want your line drawing to hold up the painting. So, put that line drawing on a lower opacity so it doesn't dominate what you're doing, and just use it as a guide. And eventually you won't need it anymore, and you'll just rely on the painting. And that's one thing I had to learn a lot. I'd often include that line drawing in my final painting, and if you turned it off, it just looked horrible. Like, I didn't define shapes at all, the values were off, the lighting wasn't good. So there's nothing wrong with including a line drawing in the final painting, but if you want that look, be sure to define your forms really well and use different line weight and all that stuff. But for a painting like this, I don't want the line drawing in the final image. So defining his goggles here, these were tough to do. Right now they look very flat. They have to go around his nose. I'll work on that later, though. There's something I wanted to mention too about those sun streaks, but I can't remember at the moment. But anyways, this leg, it's looking way too flat right now. it needs to look more rounded in perspective and foreshortened. So I'm just playing with that boot and that leg, trying to fill it out a bit more, trying to get the shape to read a bit better. Right now it's not working for me at all, so I really have to play with this, and I'll play with that more later too. And some of this is, again, just trial and error, like what looks right, zooming out, what does it look like from a distance, what's it look in that little navigator window at the top right there. Like the whole image should look good in the thumbnail and read from a thumbnail, like a very small version of your picture. If you can't make out shapes and your image just at some degree, like to some degree from a very small version of it, then something's probably wrong and you need to define your shapes more. And that's another good tip I learned from a lot of different artists, Feng Zhu in particular. Defining his chest, this is going to be cloth kind of draped over his chest, so his pectoral region, trying to give some value to that, where the light's going to hit. Some fabric fold lines as it's coming down over his stomach. Trying to keep in mind gravity, the way fabric works to some degree, just whatever looks good. Yeah, there's a couple of things that I just remembered I wanted to talk about too. One is design. When I first started drawing, I concentrated so much on fundamentals like perspective and value and color and light and everything, which is all incredibly important, but design is just as important as those things. And I remember I used to draw pictures and I'd be like, okay, it looks cool, right? Like the lighting looks good and I'm pretty happy with that, and maybe this guy has a cool face or something, but it looks so flat and bland, and it's because there's no design sense. It was just a boring object sitting in space with with maybe some interesting lighting or something, but it had no story behind it, no design or anything. So later I started focusing more on design and what makes a good composition and what's more impactful, maybe emotionally or just aesthetically impactful, or just has some element of intrigue to it. So I try to keep that in mind just as much as anything else, is the design of a picture. Like what is this picture? What's it trying to say? Even if it's just something really subtle and simple, like I don't know, for me when painting I need that to keep motivated and interested as well. And I think it just makes each picture look a little more interesting to look at, I guess. And concerning references, going online and, for example, with the dog creature, looking at references to see the proportions of that dog, there's nothing wrong with doing that at all. I know I've heard other artists talk about, don't be ashamed of looking at references or keeping photos of other objects, or keeping like a huge folder of vegetation or something just to see what they look like. Like there's nothing wrong with that at all, and I never really had a problem with that. Nothing wrong with using reference. Reference is not the same as copying. It's using real life or photos to see how something looks, how light affects it, the major forms. Because our memory distorts things. Like you try to draw something from memory, and often it doesn't look how it does in nature. So it will to some degree, but using reference will kind of instill it better in your brain and make it look more realistic. And it might be drawn at a completely different angle or perspective, but just having that reference, even if you just peek at it for a few seconds, like will kind of be like, okay, like I can see how the back legs of this dog go, or oh, okay, I never thought about that. Like look how much detail is in that back ankle of the dog or its foot. Like just you notice so much more. So it's really good to use reference, especially when you need it for stuff you don't draw very often. And I've learned to do that as much as I need to. So here, defining more shapes, I wanted a zipper on his shirt there. I thought it looked a little flat. Needed to break up that big white space a bit more. You can see some light kind of hitting where his clavicle would be. leading to his shoulder. Just little details like that. Added some folds to where his white shirt's tucked into his belt area. Working on some more folds here. I know I mentioned before, going into a mirror and looking at, if you have to do, for example, a crazy face that has this wacky expression, like, go in the mirror, look at yourself, try to make the face you're trying to draw, and at first I felt really stupid doing stuff like that, but it's good. Like, you learn so much from that, from real life, and from observing your environment. Like, you learn so much. While you're driving, like, you'll often, once you start doing it, you'll catch yourself observing how light hits, like, the road, or how light hits the car in front of you. Like, you'll be doing that all the time, and it's almost hard to turn it off, but it's good because you just learn so much by going outside and looking at the environment. Or even with this is what I wanted to mention about the sun streaks coming in. What I actually did, I couldn't quite picture the perspective I wanted and how they would stream across this wall, so I thought, okay, like, you know what, I'll build a little model of this. So I actually got just some pieces of paper, folded them up, and like got a little flashlight and put the piece of papers and kind of made some little, as if they were beams going across this little wall here with this restaurant area, and put the flashlight, shone the light across that area, different angles, and see how the streams of light go across the wall, how they go across the ground. And it gave me a really good idea of how this would work in perspective and how it should look. So, do things like that. You'd be surprised how much you can learn. Here I'm doing some different color for the dog. At first, his mouth looked like a platypus or something ridiculous, like a duck. So I had to get another reference of a dog just to see how their different fur patterns are, especially on a Doberman. They're often very dark with these areas of kind of tan or lighter orangey colors across their face and under their belly, on their legs. So this helped make it look a little more realistic, more dog-like. But again, I don't want this to be a Doberman. I want it to be a Doberman-inspired type dog creature with just a different shape. Like, it's just something not of this world, but you recognize it enough that it's dog-like, and that's what I wanted. So defining a bit of a nose area, his mouth. I don't want it to be intimidating. Because I don't want this painting to have an edge to it or have too much tension. I want it to be kind of calm and quiet, relaxing to some degree. So, these guys are standing guard, but they're not like ready to go rush some guy. Like, they're just chilling, relaxing, looking around. With the eye there and the ear, I wanted the silhouette of this head to be very reptilian-like, so I just added a little hole there where the ear would be, maybe through breeding of this creature. It doesn't need hearing as much, so its ears have kind of turned into that tiny little area on the side of its head, and maybe it relies more on smell and taste. So its eyes are kind of like slowly sealing shut through evolution of this creature and all this crazy breeding maybe they've done. Like, just trying to think of story behind it, like why it looks the way it does. So, and that tail, that big thick kind of stumpy tail, kind of reptilian-like, and just balance out the big clunkiness of the front part of the object, the dog. Because if that tail wasn't there, he'd look way too front heavy, and it just wouldn't look balanced. So I needed something there. Here, adding a bit of sheen to the fur on his head, where you're going to see a bit of a specular highlight again on his coat along his back. So to get things like specular highlights, like trace where the light would hit the object and then rebound back into your eye. And it's kind of hard to explain, but if you look up maybe a tutorial on highlights, specular highlights and reflections, you can kind of see how that works. Oh, I gotta sneeze really bad. I'm trying to hold it in because it's going to be horrible if I sneeze in the microphone. Don't worry, I'll make sure to cut it out. I won't leave it in. That always scared the hell out of me when people did that. You'd be watching a video and then you'd hear this like amazingly loud sneeze and it would just take you by surprise. Okay, yeah, here I'm adding the leash. I want it to be red. I like that red and black. I think it plays well again with the interior of the restaurant too. And on the dog it just looks cool and makes him look a bit more rough and tough. I like red and black as a color combination. Trying to find a pattern for that leash, but this pattern here destroys the silhouette of the dog. I don't like it at all, so I just make it straight, right to his arm. So I need him to be holding some type of like a leash, like you have recreationally use for a dog. Like it's a little device, like a round type device with a handle that the leash kind of comes out and goes back in again, almost like a tape measure. Otherwise, the leash it would just be too short if it just went right to his hand and he was holding it. It wouldn't make sense, right? So it has to be more practical, and it gives me another chance to implement something kind of futuristic-y and add some. I like that white as well for this mechanical object because it complements his clothing as well. It just kind of fits the aesthetic appeal of him, and it also sticks out from his hand too. I actually forgot to draw his thumb there, but I go back later and fix that. It's amazing what types of silly things you can forget to do when you're working on this for so long, quite a long time. Drawing the other hand, his nail there, all these little details, trying to get his knuckles where the light's going to hit. The hands I always have a bit of trouble with. You know, you got to look at your own hand, put it in the position you want, use your knowledge of form and perspective, and just, you know, if it's wrong, it's wrong, and keep playing with it till it looks right, or at least as right as it needs to be so it's not distracting and it looks bad. So again, playing around with that hand again, gonna work on that later. But you know, just something there to be holding that leash. Here, just filling in basic blobs of color, light and dark, where his mouth's gonna be, where his nose needs to be. Trying to get the proportions. Making sure the skin tone reads well, so. You know, that's another thing about color is when I first started painting, when I was just doing diffuse light, for example, which is like, say if you go outside on a cloudy day, light hits the clouds, it diffuses out, and, you know, everything is kind of softer, you don't get as much cast shadows when it reaches the earth, and, you know, everything's just a little more muted, but you know, I used to do highlights like really desaturated, then I make really deep shadows, and it just makes it look really muddy. Like, light doesn't really work that way. Like, try to keep things within relatively the same saturation level to some degree. Like, obviously you need pops of highlights in areas and pops of saturation just to make, you know, better contrast, right? Like, but if you start making things look too muddy, it becomes a mess, and I've fallen into that trap in the past, you know. Again, that's where observation comes into. Like, look at bright sunlight hitting leaves, like in general. You know, they'll stay within the same saturation level with the shadows and the diffuse areas of light, but where the light's really reflecting, for example, the sun, like specular highlights, you know, it's going to be perhaps a bit more, maybe more saturated. You can make it look kind of pop more, just kind of look cool. Or it might be more desaturated, where it's reflecting the whiteness of the light. Depending on the light source, of course, but yeah, in general, you know, you just gotta be aware of stuff like that and think about stuff like that. Working on his boots, basic shapes, shadowed side, light side, trying to define a bit, you know, of a tongue area there, where instead of just being kind of like a cylinder that his foot goes into, like it's probably a tongue of some sort, and slip that boot on. And I want some buckles. I don't want shoelaces or bootlaces because I want it to be kind of futuristic-y looking. I don't know, whenever I think of futuristic boots, I always think of buckles of some sort. But I didn't want it to be Velcro, because sometimes Velcro can, I don't know, it gives the illusion of being childish almost. So I thought I'm going to have like buckles that, like a belt buckle would be on his boots, that kind of tighten them up. I'll add those later. And of course you saw I changed the boots from white to orange, just because the white was a bit distracting against the ground. It kind of drew your eyes to his boots all the time, so I didn't want that. So I changed them to orange to blend in with his pants a bit more, make him not as much of a focal point. Also, I should talk about if anyone has any suggestions about what I should talk about in these videos. Each time I do a different video, I plan on doing more. I'll probably swing to different topics, or depending on the painting, maybe talk about different things, or maybe do a technical video. But I think the design part of these paintings is really fun to talk about, and it's actually more useful than talking about just the lighting and very technical things all the time, because a lot of that stuff can be learned from books, but design, I think watching anyone paint, you can learn a lot, and especially if they talk about what they're thinking about as they're painting, it's just really helpful, because it's hard to teach design, right? It's something like you got to just practice, and you grow up with, like as a kid, you see things in the clouds, and you have an active imagination, and you kind of got to get that back. Like, don't be afraid to use your imagination and think of crazy scenarios and stories. Like, don't hold back. Just draw whatever you feel like, and don't be afraid to make mistakes, because everyone makes mistakes. I make tons of mistakes. Sometimes I paint something and I spend like 3 hours and I think, oh, this looks like crap, like I'm not happy with this at all. And you have to decide, like, should I give up and start over, start something new, or should I pull through and try to find out what's wrong with this and fix it? And sometimes you work on it another hour and it just starts coming together, like, oh, this is looking cool now. Like, I just had to change these things and balance it out, and now it looks good. So, composition, you gotta think about composition all the time, and if the picture's hard to look at, then something's probably wrong. It should flow, your eye should flow around the page, and seek the areas that you want them to concentrate on. So I want this to be like, kind of back to the painting here, sorry, I keep getting a bit sidetracked, but I want this to be kind of like a holographic menu of a fancy restaurant. So I looked up some fancy kind of French food names, and I wrote them on there as if they're being lit by some holographic source. If you focus in on that area, you can see the names, and there's little lights kind of creating this kind of menu. I thought it kind of looked kind of futuristic and cool. And here there's a lip in the wall up here, so the light rays have to conform to that, to the perspective, right? So they're going to stream down, go under that lip, and then down the vertical wall. So you have to keep in mind the perspective, and it gives the wall a bit more dimension. Cleaning up those lines. There's probably a million things I am forgetting that I wanted to talk about when I did this, but this video, it moves so fast, right? Like, you gotta just talk about what you feel like, or key things that you pick up on, but it's too hard to cover everything, right? Like painting, there's so many different subject matters, but that's kind of why I want to do more of these. Each one talk, maybe something different gets covered, or another important note gets mentioned. So I think just watching someone paint, it makes it a bit more interesting when they're talking over it, but also as you're watching, you're kind of learning different techniques, for example. So cleaning up, kind of those lines were way too harsh on those bushes where the sun was streaking over them and not natural, so I had to clean that up a bit, make it a bit more softer, and like it's going up and over some of those leaves. Here, making some cast shadows. Always keep in mind your cast shadows. Depending on the lighting scenario, there's going to be cast shadows in these sun-streaked areas, because the sun is very harsh from the sunlight. The sun is so far away from Earth that it pretty much casts very strong parallel light rays. So these are kind of projected onto this wall where the sun rays hit. I'm trying to emulate that, kind of winging it a bit, but also trying to keep in mind perspective, not worrying too much about it, but trying to get a good feel. Here, the same thing with these vines. Just offset a bit based on the direction of the light, trying to get a little bit of shadowing underneath, making them pop out from the wall, look more three-dimensional. But in the areas where the sun streaks aren't, those are going to be more lit by diffuse light, like where the light's hitting different things in the environment, the light's hitting clouds perhaps on the way in. Because even though they're in shadow technically, they're still lit by other light sources, whether it be reflected light or direct diffuse light from clouds or light bouncing off the walls. Like, light's a very complicated thing. Here I'm trying to add a bit of diffuse kind of shadowing to this dog, like just a very soft back shadow, just to kind of plant him on the ground. Right now he looks like he's almost floating off the ground. I needed to ground him a bit more, and this shadowing just helps do that a bit more and helps him fit in the environment. Whereas the man right next to him is in direct sunlight, so it's a lot easier because he's going to have a very strong cast shadow. And it helps plant his leg against that wall that he's resting, that cast shadow too. Here I'm working on a reflection in the glass. Needed to have that reflection in this glass. I just felt it needed to, again, it makes the scene seem larger, it adds a bit more story. Again, like you look, when you go in a house and you look in like a mirrored wall, it makes the room look like so much bigger. It's the same idea with this. Like, by adding reflections in this glass, it makes the scenes seem much bigger, and it kind of gives a viewpoint in the world outside of this specific viewpoint. So again, it makes it a little more realistic and just looks cooler. Like, reflections are fun to do, and they're very challenging, but again, you got to keep in mind perspective and what's my angle of vision into the scene, what's my line of sight, where's my center of vision. Like, these are all somewhat complicated subjects, and reflections are one of the most, or much more complicated things to keep in mind as you're drawing. Try to draw a wine glass without any reference in sunlight. Like, it's hard. Like, you got to really practice it and use reference when needed. So, doing some different shrubbery here, some trees. Keeping in mind the reflection, it's probably reflecting a bit of a road parking area outside. You can see I'm starting some type of vehicle here, futuristic geometric vehicle. It's reflecting the bushes. I want to make sure to add those trees though, because I wanted a different element than what you see directly in the picture. Again, to give it the illusion of having more depth and different things are going on outside of this area we directly see. And it gives this glass a much more realistic look. I just had to pause the video there. My throat was getting a bit dry. I needed some water, but I'm back. And doing some cut lines on this vehicle here. I actually didn't use any reference for this vehicle, but as I was driving a couple hours before this, I dropped by Tim Hortons and got a nice cap, and I was kind of looking at the cars as I'm driving, trying to see some basic shapes, just to get some ideas, and might as well, right? I mean, this looks obviously nothing like you'd see on the road today, but still, to get some basic proportions. I wanted to seem almost kind of limo-y, like some futuristic, very jagged lines, kind of sleek top but boxy bottom type vehicle. I don't know, just something unique, different, like you haven't seen before, but you can tell it's a vehicle. At least I hope so. Added a side mirror there. You can see kind of what do you call them? Those tinted windows. Yeah, the side's a bit too flat, so I need to add some dimension to it. So a little cylindrical kind of curved area, a little ventilation not ventilation, but an intake of some sort. Maybe as you're driving, air gets streamed in there and it circulates through the car if you need, or something, just, it looks kind of cool. It gives a bit more form to it. Some paint lines there. Now this is where it gets, you also got to think about reflections in the car, so highlights on the car, and the car has highlights, but the car itself is reflected in the door window too, so, or door, yeah, I guess it'd be a window. It's kind of like a frosted glass on this door, and yeah, it gets a little complicated when you start doing reflections within reflections. Sometimes you just got to wing it and see what looks best. So here I'm doing some, reflections of the sky on the top there. The green, it's kind of a possible reflection of the bushes, and the dark on the bottom is like a reflection of the asphalt, and just making it look a little more dimensional. Some highlights there where I pop in some of those lighter colors. I cannot believe how fast this video is going. Definitely, there's so much to talk about though, right? Like, especially for a first video, I wasn't sure what I should concentrate on, but I thought I'd just kind of wing it and see what happened. I didn't want this vehicle to have wheels. I wanted it to seem like it was like just hovering. Maybe it's parked and there's some light underneath, like perhaps where it the mechanism is to make it hover around, and it kind of streamlines it more. So there I've lowered the opacity of the layer, kind of make it look like more like a reflection now in the glass, in that kind of very lightly frosted glass, so to speak. So you can't like just walk by and see in like very clearly. Here I'm doing some cleanup, I think. Oh yes, in the sunstreaked area I'm popping out some of those highlights with a brighter value, kind of more muted. Actually, it's not too muted. It's kind of saturated still. So I want to maintain a bit of pop of color in these highlights. I didn't want them to be too towards gray or white. I wanted to have a bit more color, that light purplish hue. So here doing some reflections in his little goggles here. Trying to keep in mind the asphalt and the bushes and the little car, perhaps where the sun is. Right now the scenario for lighting is kind of perhaps at the end of the day, in the evening, early evening. Sun is getting a bit warmer in color, not as strong. Popping through maybe some orangey or reddish colored sky. Adding some color to his cheeks and his lips, adding a bit of highlights to his muscles. He has to have some muscles if he's a guard outside this place, right? And often skin, if you're sweating outside, it will start seeing a bit of shine coming off it there. Adding some pops of highlights to those leaves where they're turning into this, reflecting the sunlight. They're going to show a bit of pops of color, lighter values. Again, I want this to seem a bit more metal looking, so I add some highlights to that leash holder, pops of highlights in these bushes, again give them a bit more dimension, separate the lit areas from the areas in shadow. It makes it look more realistic, utilizes more of the value scale, essentially from completely black to white. You want to utilize that as much as possible. Adding a bit of haze to the top, just to release some of that vertical nature of this scene. Bit of sun haze. I think you often see that sometimes in photography based on the direction of light. Doing level adjustments here, balancing hue and saturation. Something I usually do at the end of digital paintings to kind of balance out things, test different color balances, different values, checking the values there with that black and white layer. Things are working, the focal points pop. Adding my signature, make it very small, add a date, month and year, bottom corner, don't make it stand out too much. At least I don't like to. Here I'm just kind of focusing on areas that I've changed. Yeah, so that's the final painting. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, a little time-lapse video. If you have any questions, let me know. And thanks for watching, and see you later. Oh, I have a bit of time left. Is there anything else I could talk about? Yeah, I'll post in the description some references to things I've talked about and other artists. So yeah, make sure to check that out.